So before we go firing the parts cannon, let's make sure we have all of our T's crossed and our I's dotted. We want to diagnose before we replace any parts. Howdy folks, welcome to the channel. Are you having a weird idle issue with your Honda? Does it sound something like this? And is it possibly accompanied by code P0505 for idle control system problem? So it's going to be a pretty quick video. I had this problem recently and I had to go through literally everything, all the stops to figure out what the issue was. So let's go over everything that I did to fix it. So first thing you want to check for, the easiest thing to check for is you want to look for a vacuum leak. Now the easiest way to do that is to just pull off one of these hoses. And I know it's kind of gross, but pull off one of the hoses, the vacuum hoses that is, and then just blow on it. I mean, you can clean it off a little bit, then just put your lips around it and blow on it. If you hear air escaping somewhere, then that's a good indicator that you have a vacuum leak. Now, keep in mind that air is going to leak past your throttle plate. So a better way to do this test would be to remove your air filter and cover your throttle up with your hand, make a nice seal over it with your hand, and then blow on it. And you should be able to create pressure inside of your intake and it shouldn't bleed off anywhere. So just pull off one of your vacuum hoses and blow into it while your intake's covered up, and that's an easy way to check for a vacuum leak. If you do have one, then you want to go from there and try and find where that's leaking from. And maybe I'll make another video down the road on how to do that. And a vacuum leak doesn't typically cause that issue. Usually a vacuum leak will have it just idle up and stay there, but that's one of the easiest things to check for, so we'll check there first. If you recently serviced anything that has to do with the coolant system, water pump, thermostat, change the coolant, any of that kind of stuff, or anything that has to do with the throttle, maybe you're going to want to check there first, because if you recently serviced them and then this idle popped up, well then that's a good indicator that that may be related to your issue. So check there first. Alrighty, we don't have a vacuum leak. Now with a cold engine, we want to go ahead and remove our coolant cap here, our radiator cap here, and make sure our radiator's full. This one is. But if you do have a leak in your coolant system somewhere and end up running low on coolant, that is a super common thing that causes that idle issue on Hondas especially. It doesn't seem like it, but having low coolant or having any air in the system will cause your idle to go up and down like that. It'll hunt for idle. So, like I mentioned, air in the system. If you recently serviced the cooling system, then you may have introduced air in there. The thing that controls the idle is the idle air control valve. On mine, that's located right here. Your results may vary. It looks like this, and that's what my finger was pointing at. So you really want to make sure you keep all the air out of your idle air control valve, because if there's air bubbles in there as opposed to coolant, well then it's not going to be properly reading the temperature of your cooling system, and it's going to throw your idle way off, and it's going to cause that issue. So one way you can make sure that you get all of the air out of your idle air control valve is to unbolt your throttle. There's 4 bolts, one here, here, and then 2 mirrored on the bottom. Unbolt all those, leave everything else connected, and then you can, well, you may need to unplug some sensors to create some space, but leave the hoses connected, and then you can fish your throttle down lower in the engine. Now, having it lower in the engine bay will allow the coolant to flow into there better and the air to escape, because air naturally wants to go to the highest point. So before you do any of that, jack it up in the front so you can really exaggerate the radiator being the highest point. Grab one of these non-spill funnel kits. They're pretty cheap. You can get them for about 25 bucks on Amazon. Then with our car jacked up and our spill-proof funnel kit installed, we're gonna drain the entire coolant system. Now I know that sounds counterproductive, but this is just the way that I like to do it. You drain it all out and then fill it all back up real nice and slow and push all the air out. And to help even more, we have our idle air control valve hooked up, but fished way down in the engine bay so it's at a very low point. Now what we're going to want to do is we're going to slowly fill up the coolant system, and I mean slowly, like just kind of dribble it in there about as fast as you can pee. That'll allow the air to naturally burp its way out, and with that idle air control valve being low, the air will naturally want to seek the highest point, and it'll be a lot easier to get all the air out of the system. All right, now that's one of the most common reasons for this idle issue, having low coolant or having air in the coolant system, usually from having serviced the coolant system recently and introducing air into it. Another thing that can cause that is a bad thermostat, a stuck thermostat. So while you have the coolant system drained, it's a good idea to just pop off your thermostat housing and boil your thermostat and make sure that that thing is opening at the right temperature. It's easy to find your thermostat housing. Typically, you just follow your lower radiator hose to where it ends on the engine, and then that is going to be your thermostat housing. My thermostat lives right in there. All right, so it's not the cooling system. It's not air bubbles in that. It's not the thermostat being stuck. Do we have to spend $300 on an idle air control valve. I mean, these things aren't cheap. Even the ones from AutoZone that you know are junk from the get-go, I mean, those things aren't cheap. They're a couple $100. So before we go firing the parts can, let's make sure we have all of our T's crossed and our I's dotted. We want to diagnose before we replace any parts. So let me talk about what my actual issue was, and then let me show you one way that you can test your idle air control valve. So first, my issue was not the idle air control valve. Real quick, the way this thing works is you have coolant flowing from, this is just an open chamber, so basically you have coolant flowing from one side to the other, and this thing makes adjustments based on the temperature. There's a magnet inside of here. This is an electromagnet that actuates that valve back and forth. Pop this thing off of here, and you can see that this is just a valve that goes back and forth, opens from one side to the other, creating a vacuum leak, and that's what controls your idle. This thing bypassing air past your closed throttle is what controls your idle, and it does that based on the temperature of the coolant. So my initial thoughts were idle air control valve, but I wanted to make sure everything else was dialed in before I did that. So I checked my ignition timing. I had that dialed into 14 degrees. Everything was good there. I checked for vacuum leaks. I checked for air bubbles. I checked for a stuck thermostat, and I did all that special stuff trying to get all the air bubbles out of the idle air control valve, to no avail. So another thing that you have on some of these Honda throttle bodies is a screw right inside of this right here. You can kind of see it looks marred up, but this looks like a hole in the center of that. You can stick a flathead screwdriver inside of there and turn that. When you have it cranked all the way down, then you've adjusted the idle all the way down from its adjustment point. And when you have it backed all the way out, well, then you're cranking your idle up as far as that screw can adjust it. So the problem in my case was that this idle screw was out of adjustment. In my case, this needed to be screwed all the way down because it was essentially creating a vacuum leak, bringing my idle up, and then the computer was trying to compensate for that by bringing my idle back down, and then the cycle would just repeat itself. So after I got all the air bubbles out, and the air bubbles were causing me some issues. Once I fished that thing down there and got all the air bubbles out of it with this idle air control valve lower in the engine, it was a lot better. But still, what would happen is I would tap on the throttle, and then when the throttle plate would close, it would die down below normal idle, and then it would kind of come back up, and then it would slowly balance out. It wasn't just like I released the throttle and it died right back down to idle. It would do kind of, but it wasn't as bad as when the air bubbles were in the system. So I know that was kind of just a lot of rambling, so let me go over this one more time real quick, and then I'll show you one way that you can test your idle air control valve. So first and foremost, check your coolant, make sure it's topped off, check for vacuum leaks, then make sure there's no air bubbles in your cooling system. You can do that by draining it and then refilling it nice and slow, making sure that you get all of the air purged back out of it, leaving your burp tank up there open, letting it idle for a while, letting the thermostat open, letting it go through a nice heat cycle, letting the fan come on, all that good stuff. So get all the air bubbles out of your cooling system, make sure it's nice and topped off. Then you can start messing with your idle. Make sure your throttle plate closes completely, and obviously that should be unless you went in there and started messing with it. Then check that your idle screw is adjusted properly. Mine, in my case, needed to be cranked all the way down. And if none of that fixed your problem, then you can start looking at your idle air control valve. Let's go inside and check that real quick. Alrighty, so here we have our idle air control valve. Now, in order to test this, you're gonna just need a couple things, and most of you, if you work on cars and or you have a smoke detector in your house, you're gonna have this stuff. So we need a 9-volt battery, and we need 2 lengths of wire stripped on either end. And we're just going to tape down, it doesn't need to be anything fancy, but we're just gonna tape these down to the terminals on our 9-volt battery so that we have a positive and a negative end of a 9-volt battery. Now, normally these idle air control valves run off 12-volt pulse width modulated signal. Now, I don't know exactly what the heck that means, but I know that's what these run off. So it's not a steady 9-volt signal, or rather 12-volt, but we're using a 9-volt, which will work just fine. It's not a steady signal, it's a pulsed signal, and that's what controls these valves. So looking at our terminal here, we have 3 terminals. We have 1, 2, and 3. I'll just refer to these as the outside terminals, and I'll refer to this as the middle terminal. All we need to really mess with is the outside terminals here. So I'm gonna touch the 9-volt battery to these 2 terminals, positive and negative, and then I'll reverse them and I'll go negative and positive. All right, so let me do that and I'll show you guys what's happening inside of the idle air control valve, or what should be happening, because this is a good one. So here I'm gonna touch them one way, and you can see it open And now I'm gonna reverse the polarity, touch it the other way, and you can see it close. And then when I remove the power, it always returns back to this position where it's slightly open. Hopefully you can see there that it's slightly open. I'll do it again here. Closes. Reverse the polarity. And it opens. Now, obviously there's multiple ways these things can fail. They can either, the electromagnet can fail inside of there. They can also plug up and not rotate anymore. So you can definitely try cleaning it out if it's just clogged up, and then retest it and see if you can get it to move again. But if it's not moving in that way, or if it's stuck in one position or another, then go ahead and replace your idle air control valve. But don't spend $300 on an idle air control valve to fix your idle issue on your Honda until you've gone through all that stuff and pulled off your idle air control valve and at least done some form of testing on it. Now, this isn't the end all be all, but it's at least one way to test it. And you can for sure say that if yours is not operating in this way, or if it's stuck in one position or another, then you need to replace it, or at least try to clean it and get it to move. That's it for this one. Pretty quick one, a lot of talking, but hopefully this helps some of you guys out. And if it did, don't forget to leave a like. All right, guys, thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one. I think the guy probably put some thicker, probably some Lucas oil in there to try to cover up the sound when it's cold. I don't blame him. I would have done the same thing. Makes a lot of cool sucky intake noises.
Sucky noises though.
See it? Go backwards to your right. Now straight back. No, straight back.
Now put it on the lid.
Jack that thing off. Oh, it's really coming. What's that fucking smell?
I farted. I can jack it now. Alright, turn around. I don't like doing that.
I've been sick of it, but I'm actually sick of myself, so I don't know what to do. I'm just stuck in this miserable life. No, I'm happy. I'm just
It's like when you're putting together IKEA furniture and you stop reading the directions. Well, I don't have any directions, so